are watching EVOTV. We're a new show dedicated to ecology, sustainability, and community organizing. Today we will look at the growing energy demands and how these are starting to impact British Columbian lives as well as our environment. Seemingly unrelated events and issues start to enter BC's landscape, from privatization of waterways, the announced Site C, to the Enbridge pipeline. And out of these emerges a pattern. Today we will look at what lies at the heart of these issues and projects that would forever alter British Columbian landscapes. We are joined by Christianne Wihelmson, Executive Director of Georgia Strait Alliance, with a Master's of Science in Ecology. Also with us is Ben West, a communities campaigner and organizer of the Wilderness Committee, and Rex Weyler, co-founder of Greenpeace International, ecologist, author, and journalist. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
These seemingly random patterns are actually starting to emerge as tied to one particular topic, that of energy demands and that of Kinder Morgan, which is the issue that we'll discuss today. I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit about what Kinder Morgan is currently doing as a corporation and what its projects are for British Columbia.
Well, what we're seeing right now is an increase in the amount of tar sands oil that's coming through the Westridge terminal in Burnaby. And the result is an increase in oil tanker traffic through the Strait of Georgia and out through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This has actually been an ongoing pattern that really has only, gained the attention of community groups recently because all the decisions have been made behind closed doors. So Kinder Morgan in 2005 and 2006 made requests to increase the amount of tar sands fuel they were pumping down through Westridge. And just recently, this spring, they put in another application, which will result in more tankers. In 2010, there were 71 oil tankers that went through the Strait. So that's 140 passes. By 2016, we expect that to be close to 300. So they're doing it through all the formal channels, but communities are not being involved in the conversation. And it's just industry that's deciding that we as communities are going to take the risk for having more tar sands fuel coming through our waters.
The reason for this is, of course, the energy demands that are found elsewhere, because from my understanding, BC actually has enough energy in terms of electricity. I can't necessarily say for oil, but there is a growing demand for both oil and electricity elsewhere. And most of these projects are tied to either US or internationally, such as Chinese market, which is a growing market, a hungrier market, I should say. So one of the things we have seen is that these projects seem to be continuing despite their potential ecological impact. The tanker increase in terms of traffic would potentially have devastating consequences for the local ecological systems. Can you comment, Christianne, a little bit about what the potential impact would be in case of an oil spill?
It's almost unimaginable. I mean, we're talking about crude oil here. We're talking about the type of oil that could be absolutely devastating. And depending on where it happens, I mean, if it happens under the Second Narrows Bridge, I mean, you're talking about Burrard Inlet and soon the entire strait having crude oil all through it. If it happens around the Gulf Islands, it depends on what time of year it happens. I mean, there is no good scenario. And the biggest concern here is that the industry is telling us that everything's safe. But I'll tell you this, British Columbians are not believing them because the reality is when industry says they've done a great job at cleaning up an oil spill, that means they've recovered between 15 and 25% of the oil. That means our oceans have to absorb the 75% of the crude oil. So there's an attitude around risk that the industry seems very comfortable taking, but we as communities are not. So, I mean, just imagine, people who live in this region love it because of the oceans. They go to the beaches, they go to the Gulf Islands, they kayak, they're out on the water. All that would be impacted negatively if we had a crude oil tanker impact. And industry has done what they call a risk assessment. Mm-hmm. But the reality is the only people around the table during that discussion was industry. And they've got a very different sense of risk than we do. They were looking at corporate risk. They didn't include the environment. They didn't include social impacts. They didn't include all the other economic impacts of a spill. So the impacts of a crude oil spill on our coast would be devastating for years to come. And you just need to look at where the Exxon Valdez spilled. The communities there have yet to recover.
What are some of the impacts of the Exxon Valdez spill after all these years? We kind of have to address that. If something like that were to occur, like how long would we be looking at cleanup costs, and what are some of the long-term consequences that British Columbia would actually have to deal with?
I mean, some of them are short or economic, like fisheries gone. Southern killer whales in Exxon Valdez, some of the transient populations have not recovered at all. Our southern resident killer whales are in danger. There's only 86 left right now. An oil spill, if it happened to be when they're around, would destroy that population. But there's also social impacts. In the communities around where the Exxon Valdez happened, they have not recovered. People have lost their jobs, broken up families. People have their suicide rates have gone up because people have had their entire lives destroyed. So those conversations aren't happening when we're talking about this. There just seems to be this attitude that it brings economic benefit to a few groups and people, but the economic losses of a spill, which, the risks are there and they're growing. The more oil you have going through waters and the more oil per tanker, because, these tankers that are coming through our waters are huge. And this is another decision that's been made, is that it's not just that there's more tankers going through, they're carrying more fuel. They've increased the draft on the tankers, so they actually carry more fuel. So if you look at the communities around where the Exxon Valdez spilled, it's social, it's economic, it's ecological, and it's also, and those impacts, there's no reason why they would not happen at that degree here.
It's very interesting because we are talking about touted benefits of these projects. One of the things that we are being told is that this is going to create jobs. But at the same token, we are also taking into account that a lot of people are going to lose jobs if an oil spill were to occur, and chances are it will. Can you tell us a little bit about whether or not there will be any economical benefits directly to British Columbians?
Well, I mean, there are certainly coast pilots who drive the tankers out of here. There's people working at the refinery, but it's a small number of people. That fuel comes from Alberta to Burnaby, and then it leaves. Mm-hmm. There's no refinery. We're down to one refinery in the Burnaby area. There were a larger number of refineries.
There were four at one point. They've shut down 3 refineries. So we're losing local jobs to ship oil to China or California, to buy it back as refined fuel, or Australia buys it or somebody buys it. So we're the oil port for the tar sands. Mm-hmm. Sorry to interrupt,
but
I mean, they shut down. We have 4 refineries here. I'm not suggesting we refine oil tar sands oil in BC. We should shut down the tar sands. It's one of the worst environmental catastrophes on the planet. But Vancouver doesn't want to be the shipping port, and the people of Vancouver don't want to be the shipping port, and we take all the risk. And you say, like, what is this for? Is this for oil demand? I say, well, it's for money. These oil companies are going to make a tremendous amount of money. They want to bring these Suez Max tankers. These are the largest tankers that can go through the Suez Canal. They want to bring them into Burrard Inlet, which means they have to dredge under the Second Narrows Bridge. I don't think this is going to go over well with the First Nations or the communities of BC. We don't want to dredge the Second Narrows so we can bring Suez-sized million-barrel tankers in here to load up tar sands oil in our port to sell anywhere in the world. And there is demand for energy. Canada has plenty of demand for energy. We could take every drop of energy that we can get out of Canada, we could use here, because we do import oil into Canada. So we're exporting our resource and then importing gasoline products.
One of the also aspects of higher density is that that's really the prevalent option for a lot of people. A lot of people don't necessarily have accessible green spaces to begin with, mm-hmm. especially in a city that has as high density as Metro Vancouver, for example. Mm-hmm. But going back to the issue of oil in Kinder Morgan, can we compare potential disasters to that of the recent BP oil spill?
Well, for example, because you were asking earlier, if there was a spill in this region, what would it cost us? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all you have to do is look at the Gulf of Mexico and what happened down there. And the same thing would happen here. Who started cleaning up first? The local citizens, the local Coast Guard, people on boats. The citizens were essentially left to defend their shoreline. And sure, eventually some government boats came in and BP got boats down there and they started sucking the stuff up and so forth. In the end, it cost that region over $40 billion. Some are saying the number's up to $50 or $60 billion. Florida alone claims that their tourism industry, their fishing industry, and convention industries and so forth lost $20 billion. This is Florida alone. So what would it cost our region? We've done the study. We've looked at businesses that rely on the water, everything from whale watching. The conventions that come into Vancouver aren't going to come in if our bay. And remember, the tide goes in and out every day, twice a day, every day all year. We don't get to decide how the tide works. It works on its own, and it would wash an oil spill anywhere between Juan de Fuca Strait and Burrard Inlet. It would wash an oil spill all the way up to Courtenay and beyond, and out into Victoria and so forth. It would cost our region $30 or $40 billion at least with a major oil spill in this region. And so we are taking this massive risk, not only to our marine environment, but to our coastal economy and every person that lives in British Columbia. We're taking this massive $40 billion risk. Kinder Morgan doesn't even have $40 billion worth of assets. Mm-hmm. So how would they pay for it? So who will pay for it? We will.
Mm-hmm. I found a couple of interesting stats. It says that Exxon Valdez ran in 1989, and it spilled 41 million liters of oil. That's a hell of a lot of cleanup to do. And it spread 2,000 kilometers worth of coastline. And it devastated the population of so much wildlife that we, quite frankly, economically depend on. A lot of our economy is aimed at ecotourism and the fact that we have this beautiful wilderness and a lot of interesting species, and people come and study them or watch them or just be near them. So
keep in mind that the Exxon Valdez is often used as an example, and it's a devastating example, but keep in mind it's number 30 on the list of large oil spills. Mm-hmm. Exxon Valdez is I think it's down to 32 now or something. Mm-hmm. There's way huger oil spills all over the world, in Korea, in Singapore, in Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, etc. Mm-hmm. And every port that becomes an oil port has oil spills, 100%. You want to be an oil port? Here's the cost. You have oil spills. The other thing to remember is that there is more oil spilled into the ocean every day in what they call normal procedure, normal spillage, normal operational spillage, than from large-scale oil spills. So if you become an oil port, oil's leaking into your region at a faster rate than massive oil spills, and eventually you will have a massive oil spill.
Yeah. Even Burrard Inlet recently said that they've conducted a study and they've tested the water, and they realized that there are a lot of these minor little drips of oil.
And that's no surprise, the fact that they had to do a study. I mean, we've known about that for years. The Chevron refinery is leaching fossil fuels into the water every day. It is a contaminated site to beat all contaminated sites, yet it is allowed to continue. There's this attitude amongst our government. I mean, there's permitted pollution, never mind fossil fuel, going around Burrard Inlet, but around coastal North America, every year, the small oil spill are 15 times the volume of the Exxon Valdez. Every year. This isn't major catastrophic spills. So this idea that we're only talking about the major spills is something also we need to dissuade. I mean, this is the little spills coming off small ships, big ships, around the refineries, around the ports, the pipelines themselves going through British Columbia. There are spills all the time. So, you know, it's always a bit frustrating that this attitude of you know, everything's fine. We now have double-hulled tankers. Everything's okay. Well, that's not a solution. And again, it's interesting that industry's talking about everything's fine. We've got the highest standards, double-hulled. It's all good. But when you poll British Columbians, the majority of British Columbians think there's a likelihood of an oil spill in the Burrard Inlet, Georgia Strait area. And this is April 2011 polling. And the majority also don't believe we're ready. And they're right. We're not ready.
And they're right.
Because we don't have enough funding put into our emergency response system. They're only now talking to the company that's responsible for oil spills that used to be called Burrard Clean. And they're only now asking them, can you guys look at the issue of whether you're ready for crude tanker?
I've seen these guys out on the beach, out at Kate's Park with their little chains, and they're all out there, and they've got a couple of pickups parked there, and they've got this little floaters, and they're sort of like dragging it across the beach. And I'm thinking, oh my God! And we're gonna have an oil spill in Burrard Inlet, and we're gonna call these guys with their 2 pickup trucks.
Burrard, I'm not. I don't want to be critical of the company because the reality is the oil spill industry is aiming low. Even if you say they're doing their best, let's But the reality is, when we have a spill, most of it stays on our beaches, most of it goes in our water. Even if these guys had even if we had all the equipment, all the equipment possible, and all the skills, and if we gave them all the money, we still have a massive problem.
I didn't mean to in any way belittle the company, because we would need these guys, but we need 100 of these companies.
Yeah, exactly.
We need 200 pickups and 200 ships and so forth.
Well, that's the interesting thing about it, right? The cleanup is always considered as part of the earnings. It's part of it's boosting the profits, right? In the province.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's worth remembering here is that even if there was no oil spill, it's not like everything would be hunky-dory, right? I mean, the Onion News Network, who I love, you got to try to have a sense of humor in the midst of all this. They actually did a piece where they said there was a huge catastrophe. A tanker actually made its way all the way to its destination and unloaded the fuel and then burned it all and went into the atmosphere, right? I mean, this is the reality. I mean, I think every time we're talking about this, we should be looking in the eyes of people living in refugee camps somewhere in the world and saying, we don't really care, because ultimately that's what we're saying. If we're saying we're going to drastically expand our shipments of oil because we're going to make money off of it and that's great for us. Mm-hmm. This really isn't just about how much money we're going to make versus how much risk we're willing to take for our own beaches. As much as the oil spill potential is horrible for our own beaches and for our own coastline, I think we also need to be looking at our responsibility as global citizens in light of the fact that we know that climate change is very real. I mean, we are basically the choke point in between the tar sands in Alberta and these huge expanding markets in Asia. The part of it's about the United States and California, but really the big demand is coming from China right now. And we're the gateway to the Pacific, right? This is a gateway corridor initiative that we're talking about.
BP spill, interestingly enough, the company is not going to pay for all the costs associated with it. If the same thing were to happen in BC, do we have any sort of warranties?
Nothing.
No, because the reality is the pipeline is Kinder Morgan, but then it goes on to a tanker and it's another company and it's an international company. And the only thing we know is they're all paying into the pot to have Bard Clean help with the cleanup. But going after a culprit, good luck.
These companies disappear like that. These companies can be registered in Panama and Colombia, who knows. Once it's on the ship, Kinder Morgan will say it's not our responsibility. Exactly. Exxon will say it's not our responsibility. Syncrude will say it's not our oil. Mm. And the shipping company who's technically responsible disappears, a numbered company registered in the Cayman Islands with the boat registered in Panama, and they're gone. They disappeared. They're bankrupt. And we're left with a $40 billion bill to clean up our bay.
Are there examples of this in BC?
Of spills?
Of just pollution in general that companies do not clean up?
I can't think of an example where they did clean it
I
up.
was going to say,
Are there any examples where they did clean up?
I mean, municipalities, there's just an accident Friday with dumping raw sewage into Bird Inlet. Pollution of Bird Inlet is happening all the time. And trying to get back to a company to spill it. Well, because even every article you read, I swear this is true, dilution will help with the process, and it's like, don't worry, short-term impact, but dilution. It's as if our oceans are designed to clean up our messes for us. And that, again, it's part of read about there was the
State of the Ocean report.
It's just any example of a spill, they'll always talk about dilution as if the environment's there to pick it up. But the personal responsibility, it's always like, oh, don't worry, not too much harm is done. But it's cumulative impacts too. Mm-hmm. All the spills that are happening all the time.
Well, there was just a big study done, the State of the Oceans report, that actually looked at sort of all the different impacts on our oceans, from acidification to climate change to overfishing, agriculture. Yeah. I mean, our oceans are in serious danger. I mean, we've got actually scientists writing reports using words like extinction. Scientists don't usually throw around words like extinction.
They throw words around more specifically like mass extinction, which is really a tragic one. And the interesting thing about it, and I'm referring to you guys as scientists, is that not a lot of people tie their own destinies to oceans. They're sort of ignorant of the fact that oceans are really responsible for producing oxygen that we breathe.
I was going to say, you take a breath and 70% of it comes from the oceans. Yeah. That's how reliant we are on the health of the oceans. Every breath you take.
And even if you were to avoid eating fish or eliminating shrimp out of your diet, it's a part of a larger ecological system.
Well, if our solution to our pollution problems is that we'll just all stop eating fish, is that it? Is that the solution? Honestly, it's the way we're treating the planet. If our children from 20 generations later who could come back, they actually survive and everything works out, and they come back and they look at what we're doing right now, they'd be horrified. If somebody came from another planet and just was looking, how are the humans doing on Earth? they would have to say, whoa,
Yeah.
you know, whoa, my goodness gracious, these people don't get it. You know, these smart, large-brain primates are pretty clever. They can make all kinds of stuff, but they're eating their own assets. They're consuming the asset, which is our planet, which is our ecosystem. We live in this giant living system, and we were born into it, and we're halfway through the world's forest. There were once, 6 billion hectares of forest. There's now half of that, 3 roughly, and we high-graded everything. Mm-hmm. So my point is that, as a civilization on a large scale, the scale of our entire operation is too big, and our sloppiness is unbelievably bad.
Well, I think at one level we're just fundamentally ecologically illiterate as a civilization, and I think that's probably really the core of our problem. Is we just don't see these connections. We don't see that we're connected to the oceans and to the forests and to the biodiversity. We don't get that that this is an important part of life skills. I think ecology is just as important, if not more important, than basic literacy skills when it comes to math or language. We need to be taking this seriously, or we're just going to continue to make the same mistakes, because fundamentally we just don't even get what we're doing to ourselves. And if we don't cure that, we're not going to address these larger issues, I don't believe.
I have here a lovely descriptions of the tankers. It says tankers would travel through gray whale migratory routes, through feeding grounds for humpback and orca whales, and past more than 600 salmon spawning rivers. A single oil spill could devastate the coastal communities and First Nations that rely on tourism and fishing, and currently 56,000 jobs are there earning their way through fishing and ecotourism. So we are definitely at a losing end of this battle if the Enbridge pipeline is to proceed and this coastal traffic.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that the government doesn't look at those numbers more carefully. Like, what are the other economic drivers? It's like an addiction to resource money, and that's always where our money should come from, when actually there are growing industries, especially ecotourism and industry and convention centers. That was a good example. I mean, how many people are going to want to come here to have a convention if the orcas have disappeared and our salmon runs? I mean, 2 years ago the Fraser sockeye didn't come back, and now they're talking about this year, even though last year was spectacular. This year they're talking about another low year. I mean, what would happen if during one of those big years we had a tanker spill? I mean, we would talk about devastating our salmon. And when it comes to, it's not about numbers. It's when you talk to British Columbians and you mention orcas or you mention salmon, they get fierce. They get passionate. It doesn't matter where they live in this province. We value this. It's not even just about economic drivers anymore. It's about what we value as a people. Probably above all Canadians, British Columbians are connected to their environment, yet we are disconnected because we don't, we get it aesthetically, but we don't get it ecologically. And I think what Ben said can't be underscored, is that we need to start teaching ecological values to our children in our schools and through any means possible, because we need leaders who get ecological systems, because I can tell you a lot of them right now don't understand. It's really all about dollars. And we're not talking about changing our systems where we don't have a healthy economy. But again, this paradigm that we have to sacrifice the environment for a healthy economy is one that is so outdated, is so dangerous. And we need leadership that's going to actually start really seeing. I mean, we talk this way about the fact that they're connected, that a healthy economy is built on a healthy environment. But we don't have leadership that gets that yet. They're still using models from 50 years ago and 100 years ago, and that's got to change.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. I mean, basically we have to get beyond the point where it's the economy versus the environment, because the environment loses every time. We've seen it over and over and over again. And I mean, what is becoming abundantly clear is there's a ton of jobs in actually doing smart things. I mean, if we were retrofitting our homes to get to that sort of efficiency of energy use that Rex was talking about, I mean, that's the number one employer of men in our province, is construction. And there's not a lot of construction jobs other than the big mega projects. We could be doing a mega project of retrofits and weatherization. There's like a million people. Heat pumps,
urban gardens. Actually having resilient communities that take care of themselves is full employment. I mean, I've lived in small communities, on farms in small communities, and I can tell you, if you live in the bush and you keep yourself alive and grow food, you're fully employed. Everybody's fully employed. There's lots to do. You have to fix things. You have to grow your food.
In the Lower Mainland, I mean, we're expecting something like 1 million people to move here in the next decade. Probably more than that because of what's going on around the world. But even just the baseline projections from our government's about 1 million people. And the decisions we're making about highways versus transit is going to determine where those people live, what kind of lifestyle they have, whether it's car dependent or whether we're building these sort of densified hubs of development. So when you're looking at these options that we have right now, should we build South Fraser Perimeter Road out to Deltaport and pave over a bunch of our farmland, or should we be investing in public transit? I mean, it's got much broader implications than just buses versus cars. It's about what kind of communities do we want? Do we want livable communities? Do we want to be surrounded by toxins, or do we want to be living in places where you can actually walk to work, where you can know your neighbors, where you can have locally produced safe sources of food? I mean, these are really the things that are at stake when we're looking at some of these larger issues of transportation. And of course, it's got huge implications for our demand for oil as well. So all of these things are really connected.
Ask a country like Nigeria what it's like to be an oil state controlled by an oil industry. These people have been trampled over and their resources plundered. And we act as if we're willing to let Canada just be a resource colony for whoever, China, United States, whoever wants our oil or our resources and will pay us money. We'll close down our own refineries. We'll destroy our Canadian environment on the prairies and the boreal forest, and we'll risk our coast to be a resource colony.
And if not this place finding the alternative, this should be the place where the alternatives are coming from.
Yeah.
Well,
Shaking the salt, 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 shaking the salt. I got you cornered, the devil he said. I said you're too greedy, I'll find someone else instead. Shaking the salt, 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 shaking the salt. Mama's gone, her pretty red dress. Papa's home, he can't get no rest. Shaking the salt, shaking the salt, shaking the salt, shaking the salt, shaking